I think the most controversial issues that I think people struggle to talk about relate to morality. When I was in law school, there was a lot of discussion about, can you really legislate morality? And I think it's because people felt judged, right? And so I think that's probably where things were hardest.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, when you were in law school and there was debates about whether you could legislate morality, your friends who were like, well, I'm more of a libertarian, those folks would say you can't legislate morality.
Yes.
And you were more in the line that morality could be legislated.
Yeah, and I don't know if I ever would have put it like that. I think I would have always said I'm a conservative.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Stephen Cox, the acting Attorney General of Alaska since August 29th, 2025. He was appointed acting Attorney General after the previous Attorney General, Treg Taylor, resigned to run for governor. Stephen Cox previously served as the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Texas, which is headquartered in Beaumont. He was appointed to that position by U.S. Attorney General Bill Barr during the first Trump administration. Cox graduated from the University of Houston Law Center in 2006 with his Juris doctorate degree, summa cum laude. After law school, Cox was a law clerk to Judge James Larry Edmondson of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit based in Atlanta, Georgia. Stephen Cox has also spent time in private practice dealing with white-collar investigations, ethics and compliance, and regulatory matters. He and his wife moved with their children to Anchorage in 2021.
Attorney General Stephen Cox, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
Tell us about your early life.
Sure. So I was born in Louisiana. I grew up in Texas, in Northwest Houston. So I think you were from Southeast Houston.
Yeah.
In Friendswood, which is where my father worked. He was at Lockheed Martin, 2400 Nazareth Road 1, near Johnson Space Center. And so I grew up in Northwest Houston in the suburbs and went to public schools and public university. I went to Texas A&M. So we are rivals.
A Longhorn here. Yeah.
That's right. My wife went to University of Texas. So we were a house in balance, as she likes to say.
Tell me more about your parents. So your dad worked for Lockheed Martin. What'd your mom do?
Sure. My mom, by the time I was around, she was home with us. She worked a little bit for a chiropractor, kind of part-time, but she was a med tech. And so my dad was an engineer. He got his undergrad at LSU. He got his master's and PhD in mechanical engineering. And so I kind of grew up in sort of a tech-heavy engineering type family. My brother's an engineer, or was an engineer before he went into business. My sister studied math, became a teacher. And so we were kind of like a STEM family. We loved math and science, computer science. I fell in love with computer science when I think I was in 7th grade. You know, I grew up in a Christian home. My parents were Catholic. I was baptized Catholic, but my parents left the Catholic Church when I was about 6. It was interesting. I think I heard some of your interview with Representative Bynum. He was talking about growing up in a Pentecostal church. It reminded me a little bit of my upbringing. So my parents were part of the charismatic renewal within the Catholic Church, which still boggles my mind because now I'm back into the Catholic Church. It's hard for me to imagine Catholics going to prayer meetings and speaking in tongues and things like that on a Friday night. But that's my parents' story. And so when I was about 6, they decided to leave the church. And I grew up in a non-denominational, evangelical, spirit-filled church. And
people spoke in tongues.
What's that?
Did people speak in tongues?
Yes, which is why it was very hard for me to bring friends. And I remember brought maybe 1 or 2 friends ever. And it was after we had a lot of conversations and they were interested, not judgmental. And they were able to come. And my wife was one of those people. And so she was the second friend I think I ever brought to church. And I remember we had a visiting preacher in town from the Dominican Republic. So she was a missionary. And I said, Christina, there's not going to be anything. She might speak in Spanish. And there's not going to be any of that. But you need to meet my parents. You need to see our church. You need to see kind of how we worship and understand my family. And then halfway through the service, Christina leaned to me and she said, "That's not Spanish."
Hey, so was this after college?
This
When did
was
you meet your
after
wife?
college.
Yeah.
So I met my wife in Paris, France. So I graduated from college. Within a couple of days, left for Paris. I had a really close friend in college who wanted to start a bicycle tour company, English-speaking bike tours, for kind of English-speaking backpackers. And I said I wanted to go over and help him. And so I went over there, and my wife, who I didn't know at the time, she and I had some mutual friends. She went to summer camp at Lady Lodge. She reached out to the company. She got the brochure, and she knew about us. And I answered the phone. I immediately started flirting and convinced her to take a tour.
Started flirting, even though you didn't know what she looked like.
I didn't know what she looked like, but I could hear her smile through the phone. You know how that can be the case. And so she and I had a wonderful, flirty, funny conversation for 10, 15 minutes on the phone. I convinced her to take a tour, and she and I met at the Eiffel Tower. And I remember she asked me on the phone, she said, "How will you know who I am?" And I said, because I was flirting, I said, "I'll look for the girl with the biggest smile." And that worked because you'll meet her. She's got a big smile. So
I want to bounce back to you being aware that you shouldn't invite your friends to your church. How do you remember when you knew that the church that your parents were taking to you was sort of outside what other people would think was normal?
I think it was probably when I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And the pastor of the church started walking on the chairs. I think that might have tipped me off.
I assume your grandparents and aunts and uncles were Catholic. And did they have opinions about your parents' change in religion?
Yes, I'm sure that they did. I don't remember those conversations or being a part of those conversations, but I think it was very difficult when my parents left the Catholic Church. My father's parents were still part of the Catholic Church. They were in leadership. They were still involved in the charismatic renewal. My mother's parents, I don't think they were involved in any of the charismatic stuff. But my mother's mom, she was a Catholic school teacher. And so I think she took it very personally. And so I'm sure that was a really hard time. And then that would, I think, foreshadow years later when I came back to the church, to the Catholic Church. It took me a good deal of time before I was ready to talk to my parents about that.
Your wife is traditional Catholic, not Catholic charismatic renewal.
That's right. She's a cradle Catholic, traditional Catholic. Still blows her mind that there was this thing.
What's
Yeah.
your relationship like with the evangelical, non-denominational church of your childhood? I assume your parents are still a part of that tradition.
Yes, although because they were non-denominational, they were, I think, much more willing to kind of float between different denominations. So, for example, my parents, I think, still go to they go to Metropolitan Baptist Church. So I think it's got Baptist in the name. So it's not charismatic. Um, and that's the church that most of my friends went to when I was growing up. And so when I would go to church many times a week. I would go Sunday morning for Sunday school, big church, and right after that, 10:30. And then we'd go to Sunday night church, Wednesday night church, and sometimes there's like a Friday night Bible study that we'd go to. But if I could, I would steal away on Sunday night and go to youth group at the Met, the Metropolitan Baptist Church, where most of my friends went. And now my parents go there. It's not charismatic, but my parents are still involved in the charismatic spirits, the gifts of the Spirit. That's the thing.
You haven't mentioned any lawyers in your family.
No,
What
no.
made you want to go to law school?
So So like I said, when I was in seventh grade, I decided I want to be a computer programmer. I studied computer science in high school and college. And it wasn't until I was probably a few years into working. I think I was at Shell working as a computer programmer, and 9/11 happened. And I found myself reading a lot, sort of nights and weekends, about national security, law enforcement, intelligence, public policy. And and then I was also trying to figure out, what do I want to do? My brother had been an engineer, and then he went to MBA school at the University of Texas. So I was thinking, well, maybe I can go to MBA school. That'll open up more doors. It was my wife who suggested I think about like a JD MBA, because she thought, because I'm so interested in public policy and law, and because I think she thought I liked to argue, and she thought maybe I'd enjoy that part of it as well. So I started looking at JD MBA, and then the more I looked into it, the more I realized, I could get a JD that's just 3 years. I can go into business after that, or I can go back to technology. I can go to public policy. I can go into law. And so it really opened up the most doors. And that's why I went. But in college, if you would have ever asked me, would you ever go to law school? I would have laughed. I thought my friends in college who wanted to go to law school just had no direction in their life, and they just wanted another graduate degree to figure out what they wanted to do. So I didn't have any lawyers around me, and I remember going to law school, and I think I've always kind of struggled a little bit with imposter syndrome. Like, people are going to realize that I don't really belong here. I was an engineer, computer science guy. Maybe I couldn't read as fast as these guys. And then I got there, and I loved it. And I loved studying. And I loved treating it like a job. And I would work at it from 7:30 in the morning until about 7 p.m. at night, have dinner, go back to the books. I loved it. I loved law school.
Were your parents supportive?
Yes. I think my mother was worried that I was going to turn into a liberal. I grew up in a very conservative home. We weren't really politically involved or anything like that, but and my parents, their politics probably changed. I think they voted for Jimmy Carter over Reagan. They were from Louisiana. Most of their friends were Democrats, but I think sometime in the '80s, like in my formative years, they became pretty conservative, especially my mother. And I think she was worried that I was going to go to this law school and kind of get turned into somebody who would just always argue with her about things. I think it didn't change me, but I do argue with her.
Did you ever go through a liberal phase?
I don't think so. That's an interesting question. I don't even think I went through what I would call like a libertarian phase, where, I have a lot of friends over the years who are on all sides of the spectrum and all sides of the aisle. And I have a lot of conservative friends who went through sort of a phase of, well, I'm a libertarian, or I'm a classical liberal. And I think it was mainly because it wasn't always popular to be a conservative. I never went through any of those phases. And I mean, I think I've had similar views for
High
20
school?
years. High school, I don't really remember thinking much about politics at all. In college, I wasn't part of the college Republicans. I didn't do any of that.
Graduated from high school in 1996?
No, I was 95. So
95.
Yeah.
Okay. Since we're in this vein, and you've talked about some of your friends going through the libertarian phase, what do you think are the unpopular beliefs of conservatives that your friends kind of shied away from that you've never shied away from?
I think the most controversial issues that I think people struggle to talk about relate to morality. And when I was in law school, there was a lot of discussion about, can you really legislate morality and those kinds of things. And I think it's because people felt judged, right? And so I think that's probably where things were were hardest. These days, I think it's probably different. These days, some of the most unpopular positions in the sort of conservative world might actually be similar to what conservatives were saying during the Bush administration about sort of our role in the world, geopolitically, national security wise, and what wars should we be fighting. And I feel like people are grappling with that a lot more and find it harder to say what they actually think.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, when you were in law school and there was debates about whether you could legislate morality, your friends who were like, well, I'm more of a libertarian, those folks would say you can't legislate morality.
Yes.
And you were more in the line that morality could be legislated.
Yeah, and I don't know if I ever would have put it like that. I think I would have always said I'm a conservative. The people that I looked up to with in sort of my formative years as a young, whether it's after college, law school, young lawyer, were people like William F. Buckley Jr. And I think the National Review, for example, I think it was sort of born out of the Cold War, right? I think it was him or it was somebody else who would say like he was always a man of the right. And so I think I was always comfortable with that. And I think I viewed libertarianism as maybe sort of too idealistic, because we had so much government that it was hard for me to really think about, well, I'm a libertarian because so much government was involved in our lives.
I'm going to ask a specific question.
Sure.
So, U.S. Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, was really involved in conservative politics 25 years ago. He felt that Lawrence v. Texas, which was a 2003 decision that overturned sodomy laws,
Right.
He felt that that was like just a horrible decision, and spoke on the record multiple times about that being a really, really bad decision. My guess is from this part of our conversation is that you would agree with him.
Well, so I wouldn't know what he was saying at the time. That case was decided in I think my first year of law school. And so I'm sure there was a lot of discussion about that. And now that I think about it, I would have been in constitutional law in the spring of 2004. And you'd have to check.
I'm on the Wikipedia and it says 2003, but
2003.
I mean,
So it just came up.
It had just come out, a 6-3 decision, and they ruled that there was a concept of a right to privacy that the United States Constitution provides, even though it's not explicitly enumerated, and that what folks did in their own bedroom was their business.
Yeah. So I always came at those cases with sort of a textualist and an originalist perspective. I think one of the first books I read was A Matter of Interpretation by Justice Antonin Scalia before I went into law school. I loved the idea of letting the text go where it goes, regardless of whether you agreed with the result. And to me, that was the role of a judge, is to have fidelity to the text. And so back then, when these things were probably being debated, I probably didn't talk at all about the morality of the issue. I probably would have said, really, that as a matter of public policy, the government shouldn't be in that business at all. But I would have focused mostly just on the textualism and the principles of constitutional interpretation and the rule of law. And there was something about Justice Scalia when he would talk about following the law where it goes, even when you disagree with the outcome. And if you're not occasionally disagreeing with the outcome, you're not doing it right. And to me, that really resonated with me because there's a fidelity to the law, and let the legislators legislate. But for the judges, let's get sort of, what the law is. So that's probably how I would have been grappling with that in constitutional law as a 1L back in 2004.
What about today? Do you feel like Lawrence v. Texas, as it stands, is okay?
So today, I'd probably first have to say, gosh, I'd have to read that again. I probably haven't read it in 20 years. And then second, I think what you'd have is the issue of stare decisis. And there are factors that go into when the U.S. Supreme Court would ever disturb a prior case. I think as a matter of public policy, I don't want that overturned. If I disagreed with it, it's probably about how they came at the result. Um, but that's how I grapple with it, is really about the text and the interpretive methodologies.
So, what I heard you say is that, that the legislature makes laws
Right.
and then, it's the job of judges to interpret, but ultimately what I think I'm hearing you say is the judges shouldn't be making the law.
Should not. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Should not. Right.
Well, then I'm going to bring up something from just a couple of days ago and just kind of see where you land on it. U.S. Supreme Court released a ruling that it's Louisiana versus Calais. Is
Right.
that how you say it? Like, it's the most recent Supreme Court decision.
Right.
Basically guts the
Sorry.
provision in the Voting Rights Act that prevents racial discrimination when drawing congressional maps. And it was the six conservative justices on one side, so it was pretty much decided on partisan lines. I just want to read Justice Elena Kagan, who's from the minority opinion. She wrote in her dissent, I dissent because Congress elected otherwise. I dissent because the court betrays its duty to faithfully implement the great statute Congress wrote. And that's based on the fact that they reauthorized the Voting Rights Act 20 years ago with bipartisan support and a unanimous vote in the U.S. Senate. So in this case, I feel like the U.S. Supreme Court is kind of making law because we had this law. I don't know. Can you
So
speak to that?
first, I'll give a disclaimer, and you'll appreciate this because I'm preparing for confirmation hearings. I have not read the case. I've not read any of the opinions. What I would expect, though, is that what the majority was probably grappling with was the tension between the Voting Rights Act, as had been interpreted by the court in past cases, and the U.S. constitutional issues. And I think I read some back and forth. Again, this is probably excerpts that I've seen where Justice Alito and Justice Kagan were writing about the issue of stare decisis, and how closely, how often do you have to stick with prior cases? So I think that was probably a big sticking point, and I'd have to look at that as well. But that's why we have the U.S. Supreme Court, is to resolve those issues. These are 9 of the smartest lawyers in the country. They each take their role with such deep responsibility. I respect all of them.
I'll just ask one more question about this and then move on. But, the fear is that Louisiana could redistrict in such a way that they no longer have a Black representative in Congress. Currently, the estimate is that the U.S. population is about 57% that identifies as white. Our current Congress is about 77% white. So the fear would be is that we're not going to look for racial bias, or we're going to allow for, let's say you end up in a few years and we have 100% white Congress. Is that fair?
So it's it's a really interesting question, and it's a really interesting question that we all should be grappling with. I would probably look to the law and think about it from the perspective of race-based decisions, under our U.S. Supreme Court jurisprudence, have to meet strict scrutiny. You have to have a very, a compelling governmental interest. You have what you do, if there's a racial element or racial discrimination, you have to have something narrowly tailored, usually a least restrictive means of doing what you're doing. And so these are really high tests. And so it's very difficult to legislate in this space without running afoul of the U.S. Constitution. Now, as for sort of the societal goals and the public policy goals of, what should Congress look like? What should the representatives look like? That's not something I feel comfortable opining about, only because I feel grossly unqualified to discuss those kinds of societal, public policy goals. I love the law, and it doesn't always supply black and white answers, but it gives me something to work with. And but I think these are really important issues, and I think there's room for a lot of debate, civilized debate. One of the things I love about your podcast is that you bring on people that clearly you have differences of opinions with, and I love that, because I think I heard you say on one of these podcasts that when you deal with an issue, you get a little nervous and you just can't wait to like engage, right? And I think that's awesome. And I think we should be engaging these questions. They're really interesting questions. But where I'm most comfortable, Andrew, I'm much more comfortable thinking about the law and interpreting the law and applying the law and advising on the law than I am in sort of what should Congress look like.
Let's talk about what you did right after law school. How did you decide what type of law to practice, and tell us
Sure.
about your early law career?
You bet. So when I was in law school, I went to the University of Houston. I think I applied to a couple of different schools in Texas. I think I got waitlisted at UT. Went to U of H. I really wanted to get involved in sort of national security and intelligence and law enforcement in that space. So in my first summer, I worked in the Texas Attorney General's office. I worked at the nascent Department of Homeland Security in its first year in Houston, in the Houston field office. And
Perry was governor?
so you're right. Perry was governor, and Abbott was Attorney General.
So you were working for
Yeah.
Greg Abbott as Attorney General.
Yeah. And I met this 31-year-old hotshot named Ted Cruz. And he was the Solicitor General of Texas. And I remember it was August 9th, 2004. It was my anniversary, and it was Attorney General Greg Abbott's anniversary. And so we were only there for like an hour. And I spent the whole time talking to Ted about his Supreme Court clerkship with Chief Justice Rehnquist, and how Rehnquist loved to play tennis, and Ted was a horrible tennis player, and all of that. And so that was my first summer. My second summer, I had a conditional offer from the National Security Agency in the General Counsel's office to be a summer law clerk there. I was about to schedule an interview with the CIA's General Counsel's office, and then I had a couple of offers from Washington D.C. law firms, and I ended up deciding to go to a D.C. law firm because I talked to a number of lawyers who had worked inside and outside of intelligence, and they all said, go to a law firm, a big law firm, white shoe law firm, learn how to be a really good lawyer. And then later you can work in public service. You can work at the intelligence agencies if you want, or law enforcement. And so that's what I did. I went to a law firm as a summer law clerk. That's when I learned about judicial clerkships and how advantageous that was. I clerked for a judge on the 11th Circuit in Atlanta, and then went back into government. Worked at the Department of Homeland Security when Michael Chertoff was secretary, and then from there went to a law firm. I was sort of in the government investigations, crisis management space. I wasn't a trial lawyer. Didn't want to be a trial lawyer. I wasn't a transactional lawyer. I was more of a regulatory lawyer. And then since then I've sort of stayed primarily in the private sector, but I've come in and out of public service in the law enforcement space.
Are you a member of the Federalist Society?
I've been a member of the Federalist Society since probably 2004.
Okay, so a long time. So you joined while you were in law school?
Yes, I ran the University of Houston Law School chapter, and one of the reasons I enjoyed getting involved in the Federalist Society was we would have debates, and I could bring in speakers. And so by running that chapter, I could bring in a speaker from anywhere around the country and have them talk to our law school, and sometimes present a debate format. And I'd get to meet some of these scholars and lawyers, professors, public servants, and that's been a lot of fun.
So you're not the first member of the Federal Society that I've had on the podcast. I had Margaret Stock, who's an immigration attorney in Alaska, and she was a member of the Federalist Society for a long time. She left the Federalist Society during the first Trump administration, I believe, because she felt that the Federalist Society had moved away from promoting judicial restraint and was more trying to justify some of President Trump's overreach. Have you noticed any change in the Federalist Society in the last 20 years?
So to me, it's always been a debate society. I mean, that sounds a little too nerdy and probably oversimplified. But if you look at sort of the keynote events, there's a Washington Lawyers Convention every November in DC. I've probably gone to almost all of them since 2004. There's usually a big dinner, and oftentimes a U.S. Supreme Court justice or two will speak. And, a couple of years ago, it was a conversation between Justice Breyer and Justice Gorsuch. Each of the panel events will have a diverse array of viewpoints. And in every panel, at least as far as I'm aware, there's usually differences on sort of what you might call kind of the conservative side or libertarian side of the discussion. And there's almost always someone who is much more, the progressive also at the panel. And I think that hasn't changed at all.
I would say that that's a little bit of a confusing thing, though, in the era of Trump, because I'm just going to generalize. I think that Trump is not the era of judicial restraint. I think that the Supreme Court, in some ways, is ruling in Trump's favor, and we're using the Supreme Court in a way to legislate. And therefore, the quote conservatives on this debate would be arguing that it's okay for the judicial system to be making law and changing precedent. And the progressives, as you would say, would be the people who would be saying, no, that's not the purpose of the judiciary. There should be restraint. We should be interpreting, not making law. And I think that having conservatives arguing for judicial overreach and progressives arguing to hold back is really a flip from what we may have seen 20 years ago.
So I'll come at this from a little bit of a different perspective, and I'll describe what I've seen it as a shift, but I don't think it's so much. And you may not believe me, but I truly do not believe it's so much as a Trump phenomenon, as something else. But when I was in law school and when I was a young lawyer, it was very common for conservative judges, say Reagan era judges. So my judge was appointed to the 11th Circuit in 1986 by Ronald Reagan. And he was the first Reagan appointee to the 11th Circuit. And my judge spoke a lot about judicial restraint and judicial deference to the executive branch. Chevron deference, that notion of when a statute is ambiguous and an agency interprets it in sort of a way that cuts this way, maybe it's a reasonable interpretation of that ambiguity. Courts would defer under the Chevron deference doctrine to the executive branch. I would say that in the early 2010s, you saw a shift in sort of the debate about judicial restraint versus judicial engagement. And there was a law professor at the University of South Texas College of Law in Houston, a guy named Josh Blackman, who really started articulating this idea of judicial engagement, where the judges shouldn't be so reflexively deferential to the executive branch, and they should really be upholding and standing firm to constitutional provisions, even if it meant overturning a regulation or overturning even a statute. And I remember this debate happening within the Federalist Society, at the conventions, at the speaking events. And I thought it was very interesting. And I will tell you, I will tell you that my views have changed about Chevron deference and the role of the courts in dealing with those issues.
What are your views now?
I do think that the courts probably went too far in terms of deferring to the executive branch. And I'll just be honest, in the 2000s, we were dealing with President George W. Bush, a constant war on terror, right? A growth of government, Department of Homeland Security, national security interests. And these were my sort of formative years as a lawyer. And I probably, for the wrong purposes, I probably enjoyed a deferential posture. But I remember reading several books, some of even Robert Bork's books about judicial restraint. One of the first conversations I ever had in DC at a Federalist Society event was in 2004 at Ted Olson's house with Judge Robert Bork about judicial restraint. For a kid who's sort of going to law school and reading about these people. I mean, I knew who Ted Olson was. I knew who Bork was, and I was hearing them have a conversation at the kitchen table about these kinds of issues. So early on, I probably was a little bit nonchalant about thinking about, is Chevron deference really a good thing? It probably wasn't until I think it was probably when I met the late Boyden Gray. Boyden Gray was Vice President George H.W. Bush's counsel and President George H.W. Bush's White House counsel. And he was probably one of the foremost experts in administrative law. And talking with him in the summer of 2005, when I was doing a lot of work with him about the growth of the administrative state and why courts shouldn't be as deferential, I think those issues kind of later sunk in to me. And so
it's interesting just because you're just talking about the growth of Homeland Security and, with the one big beautiful bill from last summer, just a massive increase in the budget for Homeland Security, particularly for ICE. And I think from what you're saying now, you probably wouldn't support a massive increase in that particular part of the administration.
I think it's also important to think about budgetary issues versus rulemaking. And what I was really talking about in terms of like the judiciary's job in terms of interpreting rules is pushing back on rulemaking authority. That's where the Chevron deference doctrine really kicks in.
I would argue that what we've seen is ICE. I don't think I'm saying anything controversial to say that you had folks without a lot of training who were engaging in law enforcement in a way that they probably shouldn't have been doing. And we've had some pretty tragic results that everybody knows about. But I do want to I listened to your interview with Jeff Landfield on the Alaska Landmine yesterday, and you talked about really a hero, of extremely influential person was Bill Barr, Attorney General during the first Trump administration. I guess talk a little bit about what he means to you.
And I think the world of former Attorney General Bill Barr. And I would, since it's the East Anchorage Book Club, I'm going to recommend his book, his memoir that just came out 2-3 years ago, which describes the first half of the book is about his time growing up and then serving as Attorney General under George H.W. Bush. And then the last half is his service in the Trump administration. And I think it is the best account, good, bad, and the ugly, of the Trump administration from his vantage point. One of the things I love about Barr is, first of all, I think he's the smartest lawyer I've ever worked for, and he suffers no fools. And so I will say, working for him, we were all a little bit nervous when we worked for him because, again, he was always the smartest guy in the room, and he was very quick. And probably the proudest moment I had during my service at DOJ, and I was there for almost 4 years, was when he asked me to be a United States attorney in the Eastern District. He's having his confidence.
The District of Texas.
Eastern District of Texas. That meant a lot to me. And so I also think he's very principled, he's very independent, he's unafraid. And frankly,
He is unafraid.
that's
Hey,
my friend.
I want to read one of my favorite Barr quotes. And this is
Okay.
from his appearance on PBS NewsHour, August 3rd, 2023. Speaking about President Trump, he said Trump basically searches around for any lawyer he can find who agrees with his predisposition. He doesn't get advice and follow it. He looks for a lawyer who will tell him what he wants to hear. And in this particular interview, he was being quite critical about litigation around January 6th and election denial, about whether or not he lost or won the 2020 election. And I appreciate that from Bill Barr, because I think most folks who even casually watch believe that President Trump isn't looking for a lawyer to tell him what to do. He's looking for a lawyer who will tell him that what he's already done is correct.
So I will say this, that I think Barr would say that he said it then. I think he'd probably say it today. Now, he knew the president. He has his own experience with the president, and he has his own judgments and opinions. And I can't tell you whether he's right or wrong. I've never met the president. I served in the Trump administration, but I never met him. And I have friends, dear friends, who probably would disagree vehemently and might get really upset with that. And so I wouldn't even pretend to know what the real answer is, but I will say that it takes courage to say things like that. And I think Barr has a lot of courage.
I think it takes so much courage to say what most casual observers would think is true.
Twitter?
So just like the backlash, fear of backlash.
I think that it is what it is. I have had a love-hate relationship with the social media companies. In the technologist in me loves what they're doing. I wrote my first AI program in 1998 that predicted the weather badly. And so I admire the technology that's happening. But I also think that social media has created an addiction to reactions. And it's created a situation that things can go really, really viral and animate people a lot. And usually not in a great way, not in a good way. And I think that 15 years ago, we were probably talking about the 24/7 news cycle, and how that was different than what we saw when you and I were growing up. But I think the social media environment makes it even more.
I think there's room for laws to rein in the social media companies and basically have some accountability for what they allow to go viral. It's not true.
So I think the short answer is it depends. I think there's always room for something when you're dealing with the media, whether it's social media, traditional media, or just individuals like you and me. We have to always be thinking about the First Amendment, right, and free speech and those things, and those are very challenging issues to deal with. And so when you legislate in this area, you have to be very smart, strategic about that. And I think some states have done that better than others. And I wouldn't claim an expertise in these kinds of issues. But I think to your bigger question of, is there room to regulate? I think there is room to regulate, but you have to be very careful. And the most important thing is fidelity to the law.
Hey, we're at time. If you've got 5 minutes, I do
Sure.
want to talk about Thomas More School. So
Okay,
we'll
sure.
kind of
Yeah.
skip over getting to Alaska, but you're in Alaska. You and your wife decided to start a Hillsdale school, a classical school called Thomas More. Tell us about a little bit about that decision.
Yeah. So my wife and I discovered classical education when my kids were in preschool. We were at a Catholic school, a Catholic parish school that decided to adopt a classical curriculum. This was at St. Rita's in Alexandria, Virginia, Northern
Okay.
Virginia. And we looked into it. Our kids were in preschool, and we researched it. We found out that we had a lot of friends who were involved in classical education. We liked the idea of studying the classics, studying the great books, little things like learning cursive and poetry, memorizing poetry, and good literature, and all of that. And also this idea of really forming souls and minds, because we're devout Catholics. Faith is very important to us, and so we were at St. Rita's for a couple of years during that kind of adoption of classical curriculum. When I got the U.S. Attorney role, that was in Beaumont. That was where the headquarters was. So I moved to Beaumont, and um, we had to decide, where to send the kids. And there was a major Catholic school, and there was a small startup classical school. It was Christian, non-denominational, and it was university model. It was a fancy way of saying 2 days a week in the classroom, 3 days a week at home with parents. And we decided to go with a classical school because we thought we can share our faith, our Catholic faith at home and on Sundays. But we stuck with classical, even though it's really hard because you're teaching your own kids 2, 3 days a week. My job ended in January 2021, and we finished the school year. So I was also a co-teacher with my wife. We moved to Anchorage in the summer of 2021. We've stuck with classical education. A few years ago, we're homeschooling right now. A few years ago, when my wife and I started this conversation of whether we should start a brick and mortar school, and we had talked with a lot of different people about different classical education models, and we kept coming back to Hillsdale.
We have a couple of pretty well-known Christian schools in
Yes.
Anchorage, Mountain City and Grace Christian.
Yep.
Did you guys look at those?
We didn't. We kind of made the decision really, I'd say really back in Beaumont when we decided the most important thing for our kids was to provide them with this sort of robust classical education. And, my wife and I come at it from different perspectives. My wife went to private school growing up. She went to St. John's. She went to one of the best private schools in Texas, in Houston. And I mainly went to public schools, and I was much more of a STEM guy. She was an artist. She studied Spanish literature at UT and fine arts. And so we came at education kind of in a different way. I will tell you, if I look back, I mean, I loved math. And I loved computer science. But I do wish that I had read more. I wish I would have read more of the great books. I wish I had studied more history. I wish I had stuck with cursive. I wish
A couple of questions I want to ask before we
Yeah.
run out of time. We're really
Yeah.
over. But
Sorry.
I listened to your podcast with the Hillsdale people.
Oh,
And
sure.
one of the things that you said was that you didn't want like a cookie cutter model, one size fits all, that you felt the Anchor School District might be delivering. But we do have a pretty robust charter alternative
Yes.
schools within ASD. My son goes to the German immersion school.
Yes.
There's a lot of immersion schools. There's also STEM schools.
Yes.
There's Northern Lights ABC is a
Yes.
more traditional learn cursive, old school model of education.
Yes.
So I just wanted to give you the chance to correct the record that ASD does offer a lot of different types of schooling within the public school model.
So I want to be very clear. I think I might have been asked a question about the landscape in Alaska. You probably noticed that I pivoted pretty quickly. I actually think that there are a lot of options, tons of options. I think that's great. because I think parents have a lot of different views or goals when it comes to education. And I think that's a good thing. And what we were looking for was something particular, a Christian classical school. And we were looking to build something. But
I
I
want to
don't,
point out that
yeah.
your tuition is cheaper than Mountain City and Grace Christian. I did a comparison last night
Okay.
ready for this interview.
Right.
But, folks still have to pay.
Sure.
And I know that Hillsdale has public charter schools in Ohio.
Yes.
I
Yes.
visited the websites and read about them.
Yes.
Did you guys think about exploring a model of creating a Hillsdale public charter school?
We did. We actually I took the whole family to Hillsdale and we talked about that idea. Frankly, I'll just be honest with you. Frankly, the amount of work that would have gone into getting a charter application written and approved was daunting to me. Back then, uh, I could write a business plan, but I don't know if I could have done that alone. And I didn't have the board to do it. And so that seemed like a very big obstacle in the way. And so I thought, you know what, if we start with a affordable K-6 school and we grow from there.
I want to ask two more questions just about
Sure.
this, just because in that interview, you really explained pretty clearly that school should be more than just filling kids with facts or training, or even just training them for job skills for the future.
Right.
It should be about teaching virtue and building character.
Here's a brief clip of Stephen Cox appearing on Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education podcast from December 2025.
So in 2023, we came together with a group of parents with a shared conviction that education should do more than just transmit facts to children. Education should be more than about sort of utility and, job skill training, that sort of thing. Education really should shape students' minds and souls. And we wanted a school in Alaska that would revive the time-tested classical model of emphasizing great books, virtue, and critical thinking, and also ground students in faith. So that's why we did it. But just to be clear, that's what I want. But I think that parents want different things. And so 10 years ago, I probably would have gone for a STEM school.
What I'm saying, though, is I think it's interesting because there are a lot of folks who their problem is that they think that public schools are getting outside their lane and by trying to instill any sort of values, and that they really, that's public schools overstepping. It's a parent's job to instill morality and virtue and character. The school's job is to teach reading, writing, arithmetic.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of parents would agree that, no, I want my kid to learn what's right and wrong. I want them to understand fairness.
Yes.
I want them to understand justice and injustice.
Justice.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I know that, you've decided to create your own school to promote those values. Do you think it's wrong if public school teachers are trying to teach right and wrong and instill values in kids?
No, as a general matter. In fact, I think that I think there are dozens, if not hundreds, of charter schools that have classical models, and the classical education purpose is really to train students in virtue. And so that's part of it. That's when you think about virtues like humility and generosity and patience and temperance and prudence and justice. And some of that you can bake into the curriculum. When you're reading hard texts, you're learning, you're building character. And I do think that's a part of education. But I also realize not everybody agrees with me on really anything. But there's room for disagreement. And so I wouldn't want anybody to misunderstand what we're trying to do. I grew up in public schools and I loved school. I loved it. I loved it. I loved math. I loved calculus. I loved the sciences. I thought of school as really preparing to be an engineer, to be a computer scientist. And I loved it for that. And so I don't want anybody to misunderstand that I have a view that everybody should have, but this is what I think we want and we want to offer, we wanted to build.
One final question before I get your book recommendation. You grew up in this charismatic evangelical household that you ultimately moved away from as an adult. And I may be wrong, and you can correct me, but I think one of the goals of having Thomas More as a private school is that it can have an explicitly Christian base. I think on your question and answer page on the website says, could you opt out of the Christian teaching? And the answer is no. That's basically why the school is there. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on children basically being assigned their religion by their parents and their school, and knowing that in your own personal experience that the religion that you grew up in, the church that you attended multiple times a week, is not the church that you ascribe to today.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting point. I think you kind of threw out a couple of different things. I'm going to try to tackle them in a different order. Let's take Hillsdale, that college. So that's a liberal arts college. It's been around since before the Civil War. It's called a Christian school, but there's no requirement to actually take religion. And I don't even think there's a requirement to be Christian. In fact, I'm sure of that. That's also true of all of their charter schools, because obviously they're public schools. I think I'd have to remind myself this is probably something that we put into place a couple of years ago. We probably included the Apostles' Creed, which I think is something that can be agreed across denominations. But to your point of the first teacher for values and for morality and for faith is the parents, in my view. And that's my view. And so, but I think the school where we started, it's not for everybody, and it doesn't intend to be for everybody. It's actually, I think we've accepted, I say we, the headmaster, has accepted upwards of 60 students so far, with more in the pipeline. But I don't think the school would ever grow past 300 or 400 because of, you want to keep those kind of small class
Do the
size.
parents of the child need to be Christian in order for their child to be accepted?
I don't know the answer to that question. If there's anything, and I can't remember if it's for the parents or for the teachers, it may be a willingness to accept the Apostles' Creed or something like that, but I actually don't know. I don't know. This is the benefit of being just on the board now and whatnot. I'm sure it's probably, I presume it's probably answered on the website, but I don't know.
Well, last question. If you wanted to recommend a book, you did mention, I'll say the name of the memoir is One Damn Thing After Another, Memoirs of an Attorney General. That is by Bill Barr. But did you want to recommend another book?
Yeah, if you'll indulge me, I'll throw out a couple.
Okay.
So the one that I'm reading a couple right now at the time. My new favorite is Sarah Isner's book called The Last Branch Standing. And Sarah is
on Bill Maher's show on HBO.
Oh yeah,
last Friday night. Yeah.
She's terrific. She's a friend. We've known each other for probably 15, 16 years. And in fact, she sent me a few signed copies, one for my kiddos. And so that's great. And because she's a friend, I'm actually going through the audiobook because it's her, which is kind of fun. I'm also reading on audioback because it's narrated by himself, is All About Me by Mel Brooks. And I just
like a funny book.
It's all about him, about every one of his blockbuster movies and plays and whatnot. And it's very funny, and he narrates it. And so that's a lot of fun. But the book that I'll recommend for you, because I think you'll love it if you haven't already heard of it, it's called Give and Take by Adam Grant. So Adam Grant is I think he teaches like organizational psychology at one of the business schools, maybe at Penn or something like that. And what he does is his premise is that, success in many ways, however you define it, depends more and more on how you interact with others. And he divides the world into three different kinds of people: takers, matchers, and givers. Takers, they strive to get as much out of others as they can. Matchers, it's really about sort of the even trades, quid pro quo. I'll help you. I'll scratch your back. You scratch mine. And then givers contribute without expecting anything in return. And he talks about how there are definitely a lot of givers that get exploited, particularly by takers, and they can get burnout. And sometimes they fail to help themselves. But many achieve great success, and I think he attributes it to kind of the rule of reciprocity, and how when you're seen as somebody who helps others, people want to help you, and that again I think is a virtuous thing, and I think the gift of helping others achieve their own goals, their own ambitions, is a real gift. And for what it's worth, I know that we don't know each other that well. But I can see it in you. And I think you'll love the book.
Reading about it right now. So Give and Take, A Revolutionary Approach to Success by Adam Grant. I definitely want to be more of a giver. I would say that my husband would say I'm definitely more of a taker, but I aspire to be more of a giver in life.
Yeah.
Hey, we didn't even mention that that your kids and my son have the same piano teacher.
Oh, I know.
She's an amazing piano teacher, and I love her, and so does my son.
She's a major blessing in our lives. And Christina was telling me that I need to watch the recitals on Facebook, but I like I said, I have a love-hate relationship with social media. So right now I don't have Facebook on my phone, but maybe when I get back next week after the hearings, I'll get on Facebook and watch.
Thank you so much. You've gone way over. I'm in so much trouble. I was supposed to be in caucus 22 minutes ago.
Oh gosh. I'm sorry about that.
Grateful for your time today. Thanks for coming on the show, and I'll see you soon.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Andrew. Bye-bye.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklec.gov or call 907-465-4940.